What's it like being a female expat living in Asia? Why is it that Southeast Asia has become a real hotspot for women over 50 to move to? And do any of these women intend to go home wherever they deem home to be? Well, if those questions or anything about the expatriate experience are of interest to you, it is great to have you with me. My name is Wendy, and for more than 3 decades, I've lived and worked in 5 different countries in Asia. And I still live and work in Asia, these days in Thailand. And today I want to share some of the clues that you know that you've been living in Asia for a very long time. And you might know a few things that I haven't mentioned, and if you do, feel free to leave them in the comments below. One of the ways that you know you've been living in Asia for a very long time is footwear and the way you treat footwear. So I haven't worn tight leather shoes for a very long time. I did wear them in Hong Kong more often, high heels, but in Southeast Asia, most people get around in sandals or flip-flops or jandals, whatever you call them. And you always take off your footwear before you enter a home. And even some businesses, even a doctor's office, you might be required to take your shoes off outside. So you might be living in Asia and you've gone to your home country, or you've gone on holiday somewhere. You might have even gone to Paris or London, and you get to the front of a shop and you go to take your shoes off because that's what you do. You certainly wouldn't be wearing your shoes inside anybody else's house. So that is definitely one of the signs that you've been living in Asia for quite some time, leaving the shoes at the door. And speaking of feet and foot related things, I have a bit of a theory that if you've been living in Southeast Asia in particular, and you're used to wearing that sort of more comfortable shoe, that your foot really starts to broaden. Now, I'm not a doctor or a scientist, but my guesstimate is that for every 5 years you've been living in Asia, your foot has widened by at least half to 1 full centimeter. And the idea of squishing my toes into pointy shoes, that is long, long gone. You know you've been in Asia if you've given up on that and your foot has suddenly become a whole lot wider. One of the other ways you know you've been living in Asia for a very long time is you don't worry so much about the ingredients in your dish. And that sounds like a strange thing to say, but of course, if you have an allergy, you might be worried. But outside of that, if you get served a dish and there's something that you can't quite identify, if you've been in Asia for some time, you're probably not even going to ask what that is. You're just going to eat it, chew it up and swallow it. I've stopped asking a lot of the time because, you know, if I do know what it is or if I don't know what it is, it's not going to kill me if it's been served to me. So I just swallow it down. And if you've been in a place like Thailand or somewhere where there's very spicy food, you don't ask anymore if it's spicy. You just assume that it is spicy. And people who've lived in places like Thailand for quite some time, your taste buds actually change. And that certainly happened to me. When I first moved to Thailand, I was quite sensitive to spice, even though I'd been in many other Asian countries. But now I can't tell anymore. I don't know what spicy is. In Thailand, they talk about phalang spicy, which is the foreigner spicy, and that's sort of milder. But in Thailand, babies grow up eating chilies. So, you know, you get used to that kind of thing. One of the other things that will tell you that you've been in Asia for quite some time is that you become very property sensitive about things like water pressure and hot water systems and sewage and drainage, because in some countries that's a bit of an issue, particularly places like Thailand or in Vietnam, and even in Japan. They have very, very good sewage, but they have terrible, terrible toilet paper. It's really, really thin because they worry about the drainage there. So you start to judge a place based around its bathroom. And I do have another video where I talk about how it is that you use those squat toilets. And if you're interested in that, I'll link it in this video here. You know you've been in Asia for quite some time when the local convenience store that used to carry the cheese that you love from home is suddenly out of stock and panic ensues. Dairy products are far more widely available in Asia than they used to be, but there's always something special, a special treat that you want from home, that when you find it, you get very disconcerted when it suddenly goes out of the store. When people say to me, what can I bring you from another country? There's really only a couple of things that I ask for, and that tends to be like quite childish things from my childhood, sweets, lollies that I used to like, or hundreds and thousands that I can't get where I ask for things like that. I'm not interested in perfumes or high-end skincare, nothing like that. I just like the little treats. And when you can't get them in your adopted country, you do get a little bit sad. When you've been living in Asia for quite some time, you also have 3 currency conversions constantly in your mind. Now, I used to keep the Australian dollar in my mind, even though I'm from New Zealand originally, but I grew up in Australia. I used to keep the Aussie dollar, but the Aussie dollar isn't such a good indicator anymore. And so I usually operate in at least a couple of currencies. So one will be the baht. I always keep the US currency in mind, and occasionally the pound as well. The pound seems to be the steadiest of all of them, but you're constantly converting. That is until you stop traveling to home countries as often, or you stop traveling as often, and then you become a real local. And suddenly 80 baht, which in US dollars is probably around about $2 or $2.50, suddenly becomes a lot of money to be spending on a pad thai. So you convert the currency if you're always traveling, or perhaps you're like me, you're working. But the minute that you stop traveling as often, and you really become a local, you start to get very thin about every single baht, because you're operating in the local currency, and that's a sign that you know that you've truly arrived. When you've been living in Asia for quite some time, nothing surprises you when it comes to seeing animals out in the wild in your street. I cannot tell you the number of times I've watched monkeys climb across electrical wires, not just in Thailand, but also when I lived in Malaysia as well. And in Hong Kong, there are wild pigs everywhere, and there are also plenty of monkeys. So basically, throughout Southeast Asia, you will find plenty of monkeys. The other day, I had to slow my car down because a giant lizard called a water monitor lizard was crossing the road, and I didn't dare run it over because he was quite a big size. I thought he'd lived that long, but he'd decided that now was the best time to cross the road, so I just slowed the car down. If you're sensitive about snakes, I do warn you that certain countries, particularly like Thailand, are fairly heavy in snakes, and I say that as someone who grew up in Australia. But you get used to it and nothing really surprises you at all. I even remember there was a roundabout near where I live, which is a town that is not particularly rural in my part, that used to have a bunch of goats that used to come and stand in the middle of the road every afternoon. If you've been living in Asia for any length of time, you can also become a human barometer when it comes to humidity. Apart from the fact that my hair starts to frizz up, and I have to have it chemically straightened in Asia so that I don't have Texas big hair, but humidity is such an issue, particularly around the wet seasons, that you actually start to gauge with your own body when the humidity starts to go up. So you'll be sitting there with friends and you think, oh, you know what, the humidity's gone up. And sure enough, you might have guessed it by like 10% or 15%. I think you can even judge it up to 5%. You sort of know when the air changes. You can feel it. And when you've lived in Asia for a certain period of time, you get to gauge which are the best food stalls because you look at the queues. And that's particularly true in big cities. If there's a really big queue suddenly forming in the middle of the street and you see some little hawker stall out there and you think, oh, it doesn't look like much, you know that it's got good food, and you will stand in queue for that food to make sure that you don't miss out on something delicious. And speaking of queues, as a train runs through my town, the other thing that I think you get to know is when you get to immigration, if you've lived in Asia for quite some time, you can always tell which immigration officer is due for their meal break, because they get a certain look on their face. And if you want to get through immigration faster, you scan all of the faces first, you look at the one that looks hungriest and ready to break, and you either choose to go with that one because you're going to get through faster, or you decide to avoid that one because they're in a bit of a mood and their blood sugar's a little bit low. So you do get to read the immigration police pretty well if you've been in Asia for quite some time. Speaking of things that no longer surprise us, if you've been living in Asia for a while, nothing surprises you about the number of things that can fit on the back of a scooter. Whole families of 4, 5 or 6, including the dog, can fit on a scooter. I've seen women put on full faces of makeup while they're riding side saddle on a scooter heading into work. And speaking of putting on makeup, when you've been living in Asia for quite some time, you get very adept at yourself putting on makeup when you're standing in a moving train, or in fact, in the back of a scooter yourself when you're heading off somewhere. You've got to get that mascara on. You just somehow manage to do it. Living in Asia for a certain amount of time also brings about a few other quirks that expats can truly relate to. And one of them is that crossing the road is no longer as hazardous as you thought it was when you first arrived in your adopted country. I remember the first time I ever tried to cross the road in Vietnam, I had no idea how to do it. Anybody who's ever been to any of the cities in Vietnam, you know exactly what I'm talking about, until a local Vietnamese person just showed me that simply by holding up your hand and looking everybody in the eye, everybody just goes around you. So what used to be quite death-defying, now I'm quite confident with. Another way that you know that you've been living in Asia for a long time is you no longer see an umbrella as necessarily a wet weather item. When I first moved to Asia, I really didn't understand the idea of using an umbrella for shade. But having lived in some very hot countries for a very long time, umbrellas are excellent sources of shade, and a lot of them now have sort of sunscreen things on the inside that really does keep you cool. Also, if you've been living in Asia for a while, you'll always have at least one linen or cotton shirt that is always a favorite because it wicks away the sweat. And speaking of particular clothes, if you're living in Thailand, you will always have somewhere in your wardrobe something that is yellow, because yellow is the royal color, the king's color. So if it's a birthday or something like that, or there's a special occasion, you'll need something yellow to wear. So even if it's not really your color, you'll always have a yellow item of clothing somewhere in the cupboard. Two things I'd like to cover are things about, well, one of them is about reverse culture shock. You know you've been living in Asia for quite some time when you go to your home country or you go to a Western country and you suddenly realize that the reverse culture shock is actually a lot stronger than the original culture shock that you made yourself get used to. So one of the things I find a little bit odd is when I go to Western countries and I ask myself where everybody is. You feel kind of, you know, there's empty streets or just a few people walking around and a few quiet places. You think, oh my God, where have all the people gone? So reverse culture shock can be a real thing. Shops that close. You know, I was recently in Japan, and a lot of shops in Japan, they just run 24 hours, particularly in Tokyo, because there's 36 million people in Tokyo, so somebody's always shopping. So that sort of thing really hits you. So a reverse culture shock can be just as strong, even stronger than the original culture shock that you will have faced when you moved to Asia. And the last one that I'll mention is just one that is of particular note to me. I can always tell where chocolate is made simply by holding it in my fingers, because in Asia, the formula for local chocolate is different so that it doesn't melt in the heat. And I can always tell my local expat shops, they carry British chocolate. You cannot leave British chocolate in the shelves. It will just turn into a puddle. So if somebody gives me a bit of chocolate and it's got no branding on it whatsoever, I just have to hold it for a little while in between my fingers and I can tell you exactly where it is made. And also that includes for the things that are inside it as well. Super gooey centers in Southeast Asia, inside chocolates, that's a disaster. So that's just a little look as to how you know you've been in Asia for quite some time. As I mentioned before, if you've got some other things that you think are a real sign that you've been living in Asia for a while, don't forget to drop them down in the comment box. Please like and subscribe. That certainly helps the algorithm. And if you've got any questions about being an expat in Asia, do feel free to leave a comment as well. I hope you have a great day, and I'll speak to you again soon. Bye.